Once more, I am sitting here talking to you about the literature we are reading in this course. And I wanted to talk to you first about the metaphysical poets, but also about the secular tradition of poetry that emerged in the same period, concurrent with um, uh, a resurgence of interest in the Bible. Um, I would imagine that most of you are familiar, at least with a few passages of the King James translation of the Bible. The Bible as a whole has been translated at this in this era many times, but an enduring translation, largely because of its extraordinary beauty. Um, Emerged at this period, called the King James Version by Americans. The British have another name for it. But it was under the rule of King James, who came directly after Queen Elizabeth I, that this translation is undertaken not by the king himself, but by scholars in England of theology and Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. And what they come up with is a magnificent document. They write it in such a way that the language still has a redolent poetic quality to it. You have probably heard the 23rd Psalm in the King James. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's just gorgeous. But it also has some interesting aspects to it politically. It is at least very affirming of any pro-monarchy statements within the Bible and institutional references to the church. The term in Greek, ecclesia, was translated by an earlier translator simply as the assembly, meaning a gathering of people who, as implicated in the text of the New Testament, believe that Jesus is the Messiah who died for their sins and is returning. Assembly sounds different, I think, in our ears than church. Church clearly refers to an institution, a physical building, and we have a sense of an administration. That assembly, just a bunch of people who got together, may not have it all. And so I tell you that because if you are familiar with the King James, I myself have gone to churches that only read the King James, in church at least, as beautiful as that translation is, and it is gorgeous, it does have a pro-monarchical slant and a pro-institutional slant that other translations even before it did not. It would not be modernizing the Bible to translate ecclesia as assembly. And the emphasis, if you read the Old and New Testaments together, it suggests that there should be some mitigation for the power of a king, because after all, worldly law is trumped, as it were, by God's law repeatedly in the Bible. And Samuel talks about how it's probably not the best thing for the people Israel to go get themselves a king. That could turn out badly for them. And indeed, at least in some cases, it does in the Old Testament. So kings are not, in the raw text of the Bible in the original language, necessarily an absolute construct that we should all think we should go out and get beyond a heavenly king. But the King James makes it sound as if king and God are like this, completely unified with one another, because this translation was written to please a king who wanted to see himself as working for God. Whether he was working for God was something that the people of England were not so sure about at multiple times. And then we have ultimately, not long after this period of the publishing of the King James Bible, two things happen. On one hand, we have actually an actual revolution that kills the king in England. That is quickly repented of, and they import themselves some foreigners to go be kings over them that were related to the king that they executed. But there is an ambivalence about kingship and governance of institutions in general at this time. But we have these gorgeous poems that are categorized as metaphysical poets. The works of the metaphysical poets, the term metaphysical means anything that I can't see with my own eyes that exists in a spiritual realm. Metaphysical generally refers to the kingdoms of heaven and hell, angelic beings, demonic beings, but it also can include anything paranormal, ghosts, goblins, and such, things that cannot be seen with a naked eye. The notion of eternity spent anywhere, or even reincarnation, fits under the large umbrella of the term metaphysical. But the metaphysical poets of England of this era most certainly mean heaven and hell, angels and demons. And they write magnificent works that don't quite echo the King James, but are responding to the larger questions of Christianity. We have the works of a man I haven't made you read because, honestly, I'm not fond of him, but who writes reverently these poems about different parts of the church. He writes about the nave, the sacristy, the aisle, the pew, the altar, the stained glass windows. He writes about the different physical architectural parts of a church or a cathedral. I'm not in love with his poems. I find them a little saccharine. That's the best word I can think of. It's a little cutesy wootsy. It's a little Hallmark Channel to me. There are other metaphysical poets, though, who do very stirring works, some of the greatest works that have ever been written in English. Notably among them is a man whose work I have given to you in a very short form because we don't have 3 weeks to focus on one writer here, alas. Because his work, Paradise Lost, is an astonishment. It's the story of Adam and Eve, which, if you look at the Bible, is about 3 chapters of Genesis. Humanity is created and gets kicked out of Eden before you've flipped more than a few pages in the Bible. However, this is an epic poem, Paradise Lost, about the motives of God, the motives of the devil, who we actually understand better than God in some ways because we are possibly more like the devil in our own characters, if we are honest, than we are like the perfection of God. Adam and Eve, I'm not so crazy about. They're kind of like Abercrombie and Fitch models. They're healthy. They're athletic looking. They spend their time being terribly English in an English garden because, after all, Milton is English. I have given you Christ's Nativity, a poem about the birth of Christ by Milton, so you can see the magnificence of his beautiful style. It really is beautiful. If I had time to teach you Milton's work, I would teach it to you not just in relation to the Bible, but to all the references he makes to Greek and Roman literature, which are at least half the references he makes. It is as much a work about the Iliad and the Odyssey as it is about the Bible, quite frankly. Paradise Lost. Or so say I. But Christ's Nativity is more focused on the metaphysical tradition as it can be represented. He writes longingly, beautifully about the birth of Jesus. We also have John Donne, I've asked you to consider whether or not he's a Christian poet. What is very clear is he writes about Christianity. He also writes some of the dirtiest dang poems you have ever read. OMG. So he's almost like a frat boy who's going, Saturday night he sins, Sunday morning he goes to church and repents. Sin, repent, sin, repent, sin, repent. I'm struck by the sincerity of the Christian poems. I'm not telling you to decide he is a Christian poet. I am telling you when he writes about he says, batter my heart, three-person God. And he basically describes himself as captive of the devil and how bad that is and how he'll never be free unless God takes him captive and talks about himself as essentially destroyed by this. He is asking God to smack him around. I mean, that's really what he's doing. I think he means it. And I think when we read the other poems, we know what he is feeling penitent for, why he thinks he messed up, because we are reading him do things that are slightly unchristian to OMG, totally unchristian. And there is this sense also in Donne's work of something that begins, something we'll talk about when we get to the Victorian era of British Empire. He is talking about getting in bed with a woman. And he has plans that you have heard described in rap lyric about how they're going to get it on, basically. But he calls her, he says, "Oh, my America." He is planning to conquer those amber waves of grain, those purple mountain majesties. He has plans to colonize her. He plans to colonize the F out of her. It's a very strange vision of empire, this idea of it being a masculine sexual act to colonize. And I think that's problematic considering what England goes and does, notably to our America. I think that it's understandable why John Donne thinks he's got a few things to repent of. I would say, gee, I wonder why after reading the totality of the work. But you will decide if he's a Christian poet or not, because I wasn't kidding when I said he is. It's complicated, that answer. And then we have poems of another kind in this era. In fact, the kind that Donne is writing that are not Christian, clearly not Christian, they're part of a tradition that emerges from the coffee houses of England and the salons. Salons actually start in France, but they quickly also begin in England as well. And these are these societies of wits, people who get together to hang out and read stuff to each other and share literature and really participate in the most interesting conversations of the era. In coffee houses, which are largely populated by men, but salons, because they would almost certainly require hostesses, include women. And there are some salons that are exclusively women in both France and England. And it is a moment where women, like Ms. Phillips, we're reading, can begin to talk about things that matter to women. Motherhood, friendship in the way that women experience it. Love as women experience it, but all kinds of things. And the men do more than a little making fun of them. There's a whole play by, I'll be honest, one of the funniest French people who's ever lived, Molière, the playwright, and he writes a play called Les Précieuses Ridicules, which makes fun of the women who have these salons. And he makes fun of how he doesn't like their writing. And I bet he doesn't. And maybe some of it was bad. Maybe some of it was good. In any case, for him, one of the chief sins of the Précieuses Ridicules is that they're women writers. And he thinks that women can't do it right. Catherine Phillips largely ignores this admonition from the men of her era. And I think that she is an interesting inclusion in this course, because when I was an undergraduate, no one wanted to teach me about her, and yet she was an important voice in London letters, in literary society at the time that these other poets are writing. And I think that we ought to know that as soon as women had access to writing, as soon as they had a forum in which they could communicate, that they were communicating. I say this to you precisely because it wasn't said to me when I was 20 years old and studying literature. I was left to believe that women started writing sometime about 1920. But that's simply not so. And what is true is that women often write differently than men because their experiences are different than men. It's not that women can't write about war. It's that women aren't likely to be drafted in any society I know of. And so they talk about other things. And I leave to you to determine what it is that might make women's writing distinct in any way. But you will see at least one example in this section of the course. I hope you enjoy these poems. I have included them at some length because I think that these are really good poems, worth your time. And the questions they raise about God and sin and sex and empire and marriage and friendship are all good questions that have not gone away yet. I hope you enjoy them.